All right, hello. Hi. Thanks for coming. Welcome to Building the Spaceship as We're Flying It, Flexible Narrative Designs for Young Sons' Evolving Needs. We're 2/3 of the narrative team at Co-op. I'm Jenna. My pronouns are they, them. I was the pre-production narrative designer for Young Sons, and then I was initially hired at Co-op to be the script revisionist and writer for Goodbye Volcano High.
And I'm Marty. I also go by Marcela. I'm gender fluid and use all pronouns. I started at Co-op in March of 2020. I wonder why I remember that month so vividly. I started as a community manager and eventually became the community director for our games Winding Worlds, Dépanneur Nocturne, Ridiculous Fishing EX, and Goodbye Volcano High before transitioning to the narrative department, first as the writer of Ridiculous Fishing EX and then as a narrative designer on Young Sons. So our company Co-op was founded in 2012 by Selim Dabous and Bronson Zeb and operates under a worker-run model. So our team is currently at around 30 people, and we're a mix between in-person and fully remote workers across Canada, the US, and more. We actually span quite a few time zones, which is really nice. We've put out quite a few games as well, which I think maybe shouldn't be impressive, but actually is because we're in an industry where 31% of projects are canceled before ever being delivered. I mention all this to say that while this process presentation is going to showcase some tricky scenarios to maneuver from within our narrative department, as a company, we've really prioritized delivering final products, even if it has meant reducing scope.
So for some more context on Young Sons, it is our latest and biggest project and what we're going to be really digging into today. We started working on it early in 2023, but we had to shift gears briefly because Goodbye Volcano High hadn't yet been launched. And then after launching that summer, we were able to fully go into production on Young Sons that fall. Since then, we've launched Young Sons in soft launch in November of 2025 and are planning to release on Steam Early Access later this summer. But what is Young Sons?
Young Sons is an open-world co-op life sim taking place in and around Jupiter's orbit. Players visit moonlets, space stations, and the remnants of corporate extraction scattered through a region affectionately known as the junk drawer. So the people of the Jovian system have recently liberated themselves from corporate rule. But even if the corporations are gone, the work isn't over, and some would argue that it has only just begun. All of our characters are also affiliated with different factions, with each faction advocating for different ideas on what the best future for all Jovians looks like.
So some quick statistics. Young Sons has 8 different factions of former revolutionaries,
42 characters,
around 6 or so space stations of various states of disrepair.
Hundreds of thousands of words.
Probably. Like 3 or 4 chickens, we lost count.
Yeah, there's a bit more now. And 1 Gorbit.
Who?
You'll find out. Part 1, building the world of Young Sons.
So when we first signed Young Sons, we knew it was going to be a few things. We knew it was going to be multiplayer co-op. We knew it was going to be a life sim. We also knew it was going to be open world, and we wanted it to have anti-capitalist and revolutionary theming. But where do we actually start telling a story from these facts? We started with establishing our narrative pillars. So these are our guideposts for the story of Young Sons and the thematic ideas we want players to be thinking about when they're playing through the stories. And we have 5 pillars, and these are: nothing exists alone.
You are what you have done for others.
What we do today builds tomorrow.
Carers, cooks, and all who work.
And what makes a home. Establishing the pillars was really essential. It helped us guide how we wanted to make our game's factions, the kinds of stories we wanted to tell, and also figure out what stories we didn't want to tell. We wanted our game to be very deliberate in its revolutionary and anti-capitalist theming, but we don't want to be overly didactic or too preachy. We wanted to critique capitalism and explore a speculative future, but we don't want to overemphasize technology as being the root of all evil. And despite handling all these different topics, we don't really want to make a bummer of a game. We want it to feel hopeful. So from identifying a faction's ethos and beliefs by combining our pillars in different combinations, we could then figure out their stances on various in-fiction concerns like terraforming, isolationism from the rest of the solar system, cryosleepers, etc.
So here's an example of one of our factions. These are the Free Quilters. And on the right, you can see an overview showing how the narrative pillars inform this particular group's worldview and decision-making. The Free Quilters are a group of nomadic artisans, and so they're a combination of our 2 pillars, carers, cooks, and all who work, and what we do builds tomorrow. We translated that to be about the importance of domestic labor and ensuring that everyone has the skills they need to build the world they want. So they run a lot of workshops and have a lot of artisans in their ranks. We used a variety of collaborative world building techniques during Young Sun's pre-production, specifically with world development. While a lot of the concepts that came from this evolved or have been scoped down, they've also served as valuable sources of content during various production changes and design pivots. When you world build broadly, you have kind of like a buffet to come grab from when you inevitably need it down the line, since game production cycles are so long. It's kind of like decorating a whole set instead of just what's going to be right in front of the camera. It's like a 360-degree view of the world you're building. So if you ever have to pivot, i.e. move the camera around in this analogy, you know there's something there for that camera to capture. So we're going to get into these methods. First, we had many interdisciplinary world building meetings. These meetings happened with the project's team leads, so art, design, tech, marketing, etc., which meant that once pre-production was done, every team would be on the same page, in theory, about the world building of the game. Each meeting focused on a theme. We determined potential regions, names of factions, the region's local flora, and much more. Documentation of this process helped us maintain an archive to reference later. And they were also open to the whole team, not just leads. So regardless of seniority or department, everyone from co-op could be a part of Young Sun's world building.
Along with those more open-ended and kind of thematically themed meetings, we also used a few different tools in our toolbox, including some tabletop RPGs. The first one we used was NarraScope by Ben Robbins. It's a collaborative world-building tool where you are creating different eras of history from different lenses of themes, and the scale of the game spans like years to days to moments, and it really allowed us to get really granular with building like a large timeline of the game. We used our narrative pillars as a jumping point, but we did try to stay open and flexible to whatever might emerge through play. It's how Gorbit, who is a former corporate mascot turned revolutionary icon, was born. We did a few different sessions of these to just do blue sky brainstorming, and then after the fact, we whittled it down to be the most precise and thematic things that felt very relevant to our goal for the game. Yeah, oh, I did that.
Another tool we used was writing workshops. So fostering creatively generative but low-stakes interdepartmental communication felt important on a game of this scope, especially since game dev can have such a stop-and-go process to it, which in my opinion can really halt creativity. These exercises were available offline or via live group meetings to accommodate our hybrid workplace. The first few were inspired by Linda Berry, who I consider to be a philosopher and anthropologist of creativity. She's written many books, both comics, Greatest Moralist, 100 Demons, and also books about the creative process, what it is, Picture This, Making Comics, Syllabus. I really recommend them if you're looking to get unstuck, among many others. So over the course of 24 weekly 45-minute sessions, we wrote our dream homes in space. We wrote ways of showing care. We created Jovian slang terms. We wrote from the perspective of our in-game chickens and much more. Each week's content had prompts for writing and art to encourage participation from the more visual-leaning departments. And I think why this is important was that when the game you're making doesn't look like the game you're shipping for so long, which is, again, so common in game dev, your imagination needs places to live or it will wither. This type of collaborative workshop helps keep creativity alive.
Another tabletop role-playing game we used was Exquisite Biome by Caro Assertion. And for those unfamiliar, Exquisite Biome is a speculative biology game designed by Caro Assertion where players occupy the role of biologists observing or creating alien species in foreign ecologies, and they think about how different ecological niches and fantastical settings might create different ecosystems. We played in multiple settings with people across different teams, but with the art team especially.
And from this, we brainstormed a wide range of creatures that formed the basis of future fauna ideation. One of the creatures our community manager came up with during a session is literally going into production like as we speak. These tools, I think, also have an interesting element to them. They're rooted in play, They're somewhat unserious, a bit silly. This is a fantastic way to brainstorm for a game with narrative pillars like ours. The implicit levity of some of these exercises helped us avoid overtly melancholic or dystopic designs and ideas while maintaining some of the weirdness that was important to our overall creative direction. So now we had done this immensely creatively generative pre-production phase. But how could we transition from building the world of Young Suns into actually figuring out the narrative structure of the game?
So while the thematic pillars informed the kinds of structures the stories we wanted to tell, the game design pillars that we defined earlier determined the structure of the stories. Nothing in the game should incentivize single player over multiplayer, not even narrative content. And that's kind of a hard thing to define. We had a really difficult time finding comparables in this design space, especially with life sims, because so often multiplayer and single player are siloed from each other. So it felt a lot like uncharted territory. And when I say entirely multiplayer, I do mean entirely multiplayer.
Yeah.
So the first thing we did was we identified the constraints of the problem space we were working in. These constraints were multiplayer needs to be able to accommodate multiple world states amongst players. Interactions with NPCs should be easy to exit quickly to reduce friction for multiplayer. So if you want to just go back to running around with your friends, you can. And there is no golden path or mainline story that would possibly gate systems or progression to prevent players from playing in the same world together. We also, narrative content also should not focus only on the host and exclude other players in the session. And we also had additional technical limitations for networking, because when you join a session and NPCs are in transit, a lot of things can happen, like duplication, clipping, like NPCs disappearing. It's like why in Animal Crossing New Horizons, when you go to someone's village, everybody stops and waves at the plane, because they are pausing the networked multiplayer to allow someone to enter a session seamlessly.
That's right.
So these are some of the things that we did to solve these problems.
One of these things is non-linear storytelling. So our narrative content is almost entirely non-linear. With the exception of certain tutorials or storyline conclusions, quests can be experienced in any order. This prevents progression from gating multiplayer participation in quests.
And given that those quests can be completed in any order, we also had to think about how players are choosing which quests to embark on. These are placeholder screenshots from a few months ago when we made these slides. The real state of the game looks a lot better than this. But essentially, we have a feature called the crew table, where players have mementos in their inventory given to them by NPCs at a level of closeness that they can then use to trigger quests. As long as any player in a session has that memento, all players can embark on the quest together. And after that quest is completed, players can then decide whether or not they want it to be their canon playthrough and have the outcome reflected in their file, or just choose to be listed as a helper and then complete it on their own later.
And in addition to all quests being completable in multiplayer, we also have a feature called overhearing. With overhearing, you can see a small excerpt of dialogue another player in your session is playing in real time. And from there, you can choose whether or not you want to be nosy and go listen in directly on their conversation, or just keep doing your own thing. You can back out of overhearing at any time.
And as we've discussed, we have an almost entirely nonlinear narrative, but nonlinear doesn't have to mean random, and honestly probably shouldn't, especially not in a game this big. So since so much of our game is exploration driven, we're constantly checking to see the player's surroundings and context and then have the content reflect it. So we're extensively tagging different conditions, qualities, and locations to make content feel as specific to a present moment as possible. Some of the conditions that we're checking for include
nearby NPCs, so maybe you don't want to gossip about someone when they're like right there.
The location a conversation is occurring in.
Faction rank.
Your reputation with other NPCs and what they might have heard about you.
Your bond level with an NPC.
What's in your inventory.
How many players are in the session.
And honestly, a lot more.
Yeah.
We get very granular with it.
Yeah, it's very fun.
And these traits are all really useful for a system that we've called the casting call system, which is our method of dynamically placing NPCs throughout the world in lieu of having pathfinding. Since we can't have NPCs walk from place to place, we're instead having them treated as a deck of cards or a grab bag that the system is then shuffling through and seeing who is the most relevant to place in a certain slot. Within the casting call, we tend to think about it from the top down, with starting at the site, like a space station or a moonlet, then the locale, which is a smaller arrangement of props and environment art within a site, and then the slots, which are the specific spawn points an NPC might appear in. We call a specific configuration of these NPCs in a locale a tableau, which can either be randomly determined based on established spawn rates in our configs, or specifically determined by an active quest. And an active quest tableau will always take priority over a random spawn.
So for a more visual example, here is the same NPC at the same locale, but in different slots. So the slots each have their own animation for the same character. This is Hermosa in this example. So for the vendor slot, she has the hawking animation, whereas for the patron slot, she has an animation where she's like rummaging through a bin. So since all of that is determined externally in the configs, the content is easier to read and edit for our narrative team. So it looks exactly like what you see there. That's what we see when we're writing it.
Yeah. And for another peek behind the curtain for how the locales themselves are set up, here's what the prefab looks like in the Unity editor. The yellow ghostly NPCs you see in the picture are the spawn points or the slots of the locale. Each slot is associated with a specific entry in a file that determines who can spawn there, what animation they're doing, and an associated tag that we can reference in our dialogue system. Not all of these slots are necessarily populated at any one time, and not every NPC is guaranteed to regularly spawn there. It resets daily or with quest tableaus being set active. This locale specifically is our community garden. While it's a rare example of a locale unique to a site, most of our locales are actually very modular and reusable across different locations in the game.
Yeah, so here we have two NPCs that were cast at the garden at the same time, El Ojo on the left there, and Fares on the right. Both of them have different traits that were called that led to them being cast here. In El Ojo's case, it was his faction, Jaska, which is the mutual aid group that runs food deliveries.
And in Faris's case, there's actually a few different things that could have led to him being cast there. It could have been his profession, which is as a gardener, his community, because he's part of a specific group of NPCs unique to this station that have plots there, or his faction as well, which is associated with terraforming and food security. So while neither of these characters are necessarily guaranteed to be at this tableau at any one day, Faris is extremely likely to be because he has so many different traits that make him relevant to the casting call, whereas El Ojo only shares his probability with other members of his faction. So we sidestepped pathfinding network issues with our dynamic casting call systems, and we avoided progression-gated multiplayer by making it all nonlinear.
But in making it nonlinear, we opened up a whole new can of worms in figuring out our storylines. So for our character storylines, we wanted rich, layered stories of post-revolutionary life, but we struggled with figuring out how to have nonlinear, multi-arc storylines make sense in any order, and have them accommodate multiple world states from different players in the same sessions. But then our thematic pillars saved the day.
So rather than having one character be the focus with multiple arcs that could be experienced in any order, we shifted the emphasis to be about multiple arcs within a community of characters. These arcs all exist in conversation with each other, but they're independent enough that playing them in any order is still emotionally effective. And this actually aligns way better with our broader intention of having post-revolutionary stories, because rather than hero narratives where some characters are more important than others, we're able to share the emphasis and the focus and see what kind of characters and people it takes to make a revolution work. Okay, so we fixed multiplayer narrative forever. Now we just have to write everything, right?
Hold on, Jenna.
Oh no.
Part 2, drawing the rest of the owl proves more complicated than previously expected.
So we presented the order of everything here pretty cleanly and linearly, but I think as a lot of you know, game production is usually anything but. We were establishing pillars and solving design problems, but they weren't necessarily happening in the correct or useful order.
We had a vertical slice quest written after factions were created, but before we had established the community storyline direction. So the characters had different levels of importance and realization.
And then after we shifted to be community storylines to have shared emphasis, we wrote a prototype community storyline, but it felt really unspecific and hazy because we hadn't figured out regions yet, so it really lacked a sense of place.
And even after we had specified locations, they weren't necessarily going to become fully realized until much, much later. So we got all of our ducks in a row, but we initially planned our team roadmap around the expectation that quests were the primary narrative content players would be experiencing.
So quests needed to be designed and implemented ASAP in order to de-risk it and give us the maximum time possible to write content for it. Because as we saw earlier, there's a lot of considerations for making multiplayer non-linear quests. But even after figuring out what we needed to do, we're smaller cogs in the larger machine of the game studio, and all of the verbs that a quest needs to be playable is dependent on systems built by the tech team. So even if our dialogue was technically testable and that we could run the yarn files and see them in Unity, none of the other systems we needed to actually see how players would be experiencing this content were there, so we couldn't actually get an accurate representation of what it would feel like in context. And eventually quests ended up getting delayed, but we still needed characters to populate the world somehow.
Due to our game preview requirements, we knew we had to ship something for a lot of different characters. And so this is what we could write. Introductions, banter lines. The banter lines are the ones you saw above the characters' heads. Daily chats, openers, closers, and fallbacks. Often this was still happening with less in-game playability than is ideal, but we had some workarounds. Our narrative department being so integrated into the rest of the team during the initial world building meant that even though we were writing characters talking about settings that literally didn't exist yet, there were often way fewer than anticipated technical edits needed when locales and sites were finally integrated into the build. And for pacing and flow, before we were even able to play our characters in engine, we would also act out their lines for pacing and rhythm.
So to give you a better idea of what all of those content types are, here's how we organize our NPCs files. We use Yarn Spinner for just about everything. It has a lot of native saliency tooling, especially since their 3.0 update, and we are using all of it very fully. The diagram to the left here is essentially how all of our NPC files are structured. We have different node groups that all share the same title, but have different conditions attached so that they can be bounced around to, but still feel very modular and specific in different contexts. And for any instance in which an NPC is cast, but they don't have appropriately specific dialogue, they'll default to either more general or shared dialogue based on the location. So this is what our typical NPC flow looks like. We check to see if there's a priority storylet, like an introduction if you haven't met the character before. And if there's no priority content to see, then it takes you to the opener, which then takes you to like the basic conversation tree. We have daily content that can be seen once and then exhausted. Theoretically, we have a way to access quest content that doesn't yet exist, so it's just going to take you to a fallback. And then if you decide that you don't want to talk to this NPC any further, it takes you to the closer, and then the interaction ends. We wanted these interactions to be as quick and easy to get in and out of as possible to reduce the friction for multiplayer, because if you don't care about talking to NPCs and just want to go back to jumping around with your friends, go for it. But if you want further narrative content, you can opt in. And then here's what the actual files look like. You can pause this in the recording. This is just for like the sickos among us that like to get a peek under the hood. But essentially we use a skeleton file that appends the node groups based on the NPC's name. And it runs a certain list of priority-based redirects, checking to see if there's prioritized content and then defaulting to less specific and then less specific and then less specific all the way down. But it always looks to see if a character has unique dialogue first, and if it doesn't, it looks to see what the shared dialogue is. But the shared dialogue is so very rarely seen that the odds of someone getting cast somewhere they don't have something unique to say about it are very low.
Yeah.
To see it in action, let's say the conversation is Thaddeus. The flow skeleton automatically looks to see if Thaddeus has any openers that can be called that match the specific locale that he's in, which is the community garden again. It then looks for the node with the most conditions met. Could be based on the slot in the garden that he's in or who else is at the garden, but it doesn't look like anything is more relevant than just him being at the garden at all. And then within that node, it checks to see your bond level and then gives you content that reflects how close you've gotten with him over the course of playing. Our casting call is entirely driven by each character's config entry listing their castable traits and qualities. But before we can actually fill out these entries, we need to go back and actually pitch the character and their story first. And we also need a pretty sizable cast to have the casting call feel dynamic instead of just the same 3 NPCs. These 3 NPCs by themselves are not going to make a world feel rich and populated, so we need way more.
Yeah, let's add 39 more. These ones pictured aren't even all of our characters. We're at 42 now. And at first, our pitches were for each station's residents, but that changed as time went on. Our flexible, community-oriented approach to the characters, as opposed to the more traditional hero-centric narrative structures, meant that whenever there were gaps or needs from other departments, we could realistically fill them in again, an additive way, as opposed to having to Frankenstein or sort of like mush together existing characters to fit design needs. And what's cool about the way that content is written on Young Suns is that regardless of whether these characters will ever get to have bond arcs or more complex storylines within the time frame of our production, it's relatively low cost to make a new character, especially now that you can actually make the design of them within our character creator. And so it just serves to meet the production needs without causing major costs down the line or, again, jeopardizing the storylines of existing characters. So in terms of characters who we made to fill a niche, these three characters, Basil, Close, and Gus, were made specifically to fit the needs of the tutorial, while these ones were out-of-region characters from our first guest writer, Laura Shea. With a solid batch of preliminary content, introduction, 5 daily chats, openers, closers, fallbacks, a character can actually feel relatively lived in quite quickly. And this is especially true if you're taking advantage of salient dialogue and if statements in Yarn. Everything about this is like additive and about building outwards. Every new character rounds out the world so much and provides valuable connections to existing NPCs. But this means that all of them need to have fairly thorough character pages so that other writers can integrate them into their own writing. Otherwise, these new characters would end up with sort of like an isolated vibe that was disconnected from the rest of the neighborhood. So let's take a closer look at a few character pages. You can really set yourself up for success through detailed process. And I'm going to show you what I mean through using these two examples. On the left, you see Archie, who is a very early character before we could even test an engine. I actually think she may have been the first character alongside her brother Morton, her evil brother Morton. And then on the right is B, an absolutely juicy character page filled out with so much backstory, character connections. You can tell that this one was done after we had realized we'd really be needing thorough notes on character production with all of the coming back to old content that we noticed that we were doing. You can see like Archie's is like mostly bullet points. But then after this era, we really just got like so deep.
B is also an eco-terrorist, if that matters to anybody.
I think it matters. Along these same lines, we needed easy ways to reference and build upon the connections between characters, which means we needed to pull out a queer rite of passage, the chart, for my former L-word heads out there. This is our beloved gossip pipeline. It's basically a census of our characters.
Oh. The charts that we made the charts helped make referencing characters' facts way easier, which is really helpful for when you're trying to write quickly. And we have guest writers like Laura who will come in and maybe not have the same time frame of working as everybody else. So they just need to be able to quickly go in, go out, see what they know.
Yeah.
And the kind of things that we tracked was not just like their castable traits, but then also personal traits, like what their origins and cultural groups were, who moonlights as a wrestler, who gossips to who, and how the flow of information works, the age and gender distribution, stuff like that.
Super helpful. The other element that we had to incorporate into our character planning was where all these characters would show up, interior and exterior settings. So here's an overview of the types of locales we expected to have when NPCs were first being developed. And it's worth noting here that the story that we're trying to tell about all of these NPCs is that they're working. So all of these locales are built off of the type of labor that those particular NPCs would be engaging in. And the intention for the locales was that they would be associated with those factions. So as an example, like the food bubble from Moonlets, that's like the exterior, would be for the mutual aid group Jaska, like to leave and take out food for people that need it. And then for inside stations, the community garden, like we saw before, like Fares was there, other gardeners. It's like a place where you can also get plants. And the workers there are usually from our agricultural faction. But then we had one major setback that happened during a content pivot, a delay on Moonlit locales. This meant that our storylets that took place outdoors were no longer relevant, at least for the time being. For some characters, this meant having to refill with indoor locale-based content to re-reach that minimum viable content threshold, which is major work. But I think it was helpful knowing that in theory, all of this content would be relevant when we did get moonlit locales into production. In the meantime, though, we refocused our efforts on indoor settings, meaning derelict and non-derelict station locales and transceiver, that's ship-to-ship convos. One major pop culture reference here was Star Trek DS9, where there is an ensemble cast and the primary character development happens indoors with everyone together, and also kind of revolves around space station politics and inner workings. Headcanon can also help with this, considering why characters aren't outdoors and occasionally writing with that in mind. So maybe having characters talking about how polluted it is or the dangers of moonlit exploration or like how brave sundogs are can imply why certain characters aren't seen on moonlets without being such a firm rule that it can't be waved off later. It's like yet another example of keeping things vague, making production easier in the long term. And scale helps here too. The world of Young Suns is spacious enough that we can suspend our disbelief when we're not running into characters outside. And I think for us, like for the dev team, we really hope that when we finally do get to see them out there, it will make the world feel that much more alive. So with our launch on the horizon, we can't sit here and tell you that it's all working out perfectly. We've only just begun production on our quests, for example, and moonlit locales are still in progress. But our foundational work means that we can avoid the dreaded process halts we were talking about earlier during key production moments, because if this wasn't the case, we'd likely have had long periods where we wouldn't have been able to safely write a ton of content, followed by very short, horrifying bursts of crunch.
So that brings us to the challenge. We not only have to figure out how to realize our design intentions and establish the quality level of content we want in the game, but we also have to write content that's future-proof both narratively and systemically. So we're basically asking ourselves, how do we write content that we won't have to deprecate or rewrite later down the line? The biggest thing that's really helped us and helped us save momentum has been the fact that our casting call system is as modular as it is. While we tend to look at things from site to locale to slot, the locales are actually so modular that they can be moved from different sites. They're self-contained and they can be reused in a way that will let us write content specific to the locale that's agnostic of the larger site that it's in. And locale-based storytelling is generally always going to feel more specific to the player because it dictates what the NPC is doing and the kind of work they're doing, and the kind of story that we're telling with their presence, versus site-based storytelling is conveyed more through what locales are on the site itself and what tableaus are active at those locales. As more of the game gets fleshed out, we're able to go back in and add specificity where it feels appropriate. And an important part of figuring out where specificity will go the extra mile comes through playtesting. So now that we're actually able to playtest and see where NPCs are spawning, how the spawn rates feel, it's a lot easier to write new content because we're not operating on abstract ideas of what the systems will be. It can be really hard to see how those probabilities feel to players without actually seeing it in context, because otherwise the spawn rates are just percentages. And now that the game is playable, we can answer questions like, what is the kind of content that's the most rewarding to experience in lieu of having quests? And what kind of content is going to be seen the most by players, even if they're not playing a whole ton? Thanks to our, thanks to our existing, I'm going to save that for another slide. Oops, we forgot. A lot of the screenshots we've been showing in this presentation are of banter lines because they're one of the easiest kinds of content for us to rapidly write a really high volume of. They're one line, they have a short character limit, and they don't require any interaction from the player. They're just triggered based on proximity of going near an NPC. It's also always locale specific, and as the game has been built further and further, we can introduce more and more conditions to make banter feel even more varied, like slots, proximity of other NPCs, and so on. The screenshot is from when travelers were all naked because we hadn't yet established their appearances, but it's okay, everybody has clothes now.
You know?
But to go back to our early example of, most of our narrative content early on was daily chats because we didn't have quest systems yet, so those became the bulk of our focus while we waited for other things to be unblocked. We also know what characters are going to appear more frequently in certain places, and we are able to adjust our deliverable scope based on that. Quests got delayed again, But in the meantime, other content types became available to us. But to go back to the early example of the community garden, since we know that Faddis has so many different traits that are making him more likely to be cast there, we know that he's probably going to exhaust his locale-specific content sooner than an NPC like El Ojo, who's less likely to appear there. So we're able to adjust the deliverable scope to have the bulk of the focus for writing for Faddis orbit around the community garden, versus El Ojo, it's less important for him. If we write too much for El Ojo, someone who's not likely to spawn there, it means that there's a higher chance of that content never really getting seen. So we've kind of wasted our time at the moment.
We also worked on new content types, and those were favors, which are small, untracked pseudo quests where NPCs ask for a quick task like repairing or delivering items or talking to someone that they've been avoiding. Rumors, which are additional dialogue content after a daily chat has already been seen, where NPCs offer advice on places to go and people to meet or avoid. Travelers who are visiting NPCs from other regions, some of whom might have ties to residents of the junk drawer. And all of the above content lives entirely within Yarn and existing configs.
It did take some hooking up for things like rumors, because those help track things on the ship map. But for the most part, our narrative director, Kevin Snow, was largely responsible for setting up basically all of these new content types. And it was done in such a way that we had very little dependency on other teams. So while tech team is still working on their own tasks, we're able to find ways around our existing blocked content by giving ourselves new things to work on that still help contribute to the depth of the game. So nowadays, our NPC flow actually looks a little bit more like this. It's still the same basic skeleton, but we're able to slot in the new content types. So after you've seen a daily chat, instead of getting a fallback right away, if the NPC has something to recommend you, they'll tell you a rumor about it. And we still don't have quests, but now we have favors, which is the same basic idea of you're offering a service to an NPC, so they'll ask you for something. Because our conversation tree is built so modularly and flexibly, it has made it really easy to continuously update things without having to break it all down and then build it back up.
Some feedback that our narrative director received during production meant that we had to find a way to make our region's biggest station, Wednesday, look and feel more chaotic and alive. One solution we had was adding inaccessible NPCs doing tasks or sitting in unreachable but still visible parts of the station. You can see the NPC on the balcony there. And another solution was adding a variety of traveler characters. Abu Hassan up in the right corner is one example, from outside of the region. These are essentially tourists at Wednesday, whose production costs are low and whose future development can be flexible. The characters only need something called quick chats and an introduction. And the quick chat is an even shorter version of our daily chat storylet type. If later in the production we have time, or if Young Suns is successful and requires additional content updates, these characters will have fully fleshed out character pages, those ones that we referenced earlier, and bond arcs to pull from that we can just come back to. This can happen whether the additional content happens in our current region of the junk drawer or in the home region of the traveler, if that is the region that goes into development next. So an example here is Spud Tib at the bottom. Spud Tib is someone who feels useless and anxious when on holiday in the drawer. So any future content here would reflect that. But if by the time this character needs a bond arc, their home region has gone into production, I'll deepen my connection with them in a place where they're fully fulfilled by their work. So their arc and content will have different tone. Spud Tib only has like a tiny bit of in-game content compared to all the other content we have, but they have this detailed character page and multiple potential arc possibilities. And doing that extra work of future-proofing the characters for different directions and settings while you're still in the pitching stage, I think is super important, because that first fuzzy front end is usually the most creatively generative part of character development, and it's one that you rarely find the energy of again. And so by leaving yourself these little bread baskets for each direction production could possibly go in, you can be flexible with less morale loss, which is essential in building genuine feeling characters, in my opinion. So there you go. Here's the revised version of the NPC interaction flow, this time for traveler characters. So you can see it checks the bond. You go talk to the NPC, checks the bond, and then if they're a stranger, introduction, interaction ends. Or if you already know them, you go straight to a quick chat, and then the conversation ends. Starting from a narrative-first workflow on things like items, resources, and brainstorming meant that by the time design settled on their needs, our content was sometimes out of sync with them. I'm just going to go through also, I forgot to say, these are some alignment drift problems and then some solutions. So in situations like our item pipeline, where we were often having to write descriptions for items that didn't exist yet, so that we could meet our strict localization requirements. So we've been able to take advantage of being an early access title by postponing some item descriptions, leaving them blank until 1.0 so that by the time we come back to them, ideally visuals exist, which will minimize the need for rewrites. In another situation, we had hundreds of words worth of content for Jovipedia and Trees, those are like our in-game encyclopedia, related to in-game resources that a year and a half later may or may not have remained aligned with design's intentions. This meant we had to find ways to force editorial on content from a long time ago with departments who don't regularly have to deal with reviewing such high word counts on lore about space batteries, and who were also now firmly out of that fun, fuzzy front end of pre-production when these were written, and squarely in, oh my God, it's the final stretch mode. We worked on some visual ways of shorthanding this type of narrative content, which helped us get answers from a team with limited availability.
So all that being said, while our characters have responded well to, our players have responded well to our characters and our storytelling so far, no amount of interesting conversations can substitute for like a quest loop. Quests are currently in production right now for our next major update this summer, and if we hadn't done as much prep work for them as we had over the last few years, we would not have nearly as many to go for the update as we will. It still isn't as many as we'd hoped for, but we haven't had to significantly rewrite anything, which I think is a huge win. But hindsight is, as always, 2020. So Pandora's box has been opened, and we are now in the opposite problem we've had for all of production in that everything is unblocked, so it's a lot of writing to do. We have so much to manage, but it would be a lot harder if we hadn't laid a really strong foundation like we have.
Yeah, one of that bit of groundwork that we did was that so much of our established pillars and early world building habits later allowed us enough wiggle room to be flexible with our writing throughout the changing production process. And as 3 documentation heads, we were left fairly well set up for success in that particular regard. For myself, as someone from outside games, this was a practice from working in graphic novel publishing and on poetic nonfiction manuscripts, where proper archiving and note-taking is vital in project accuracy. And for Jenna, they are an absolute Notion wizard and have made navigating vast amounts of information intuitive and easy to cross-reference on our narrative hub. And Kevin has been in this industry long enough to value documentation for the production lifesaver that it is. We always try to have a doc we can reference when other departments request info. And interestingly, some of our oldest brief docs are some of our most used to this day. I think part of this is due to our production delays, and part of it is due to the additive approach of our narrative systems. While job boards, for example, were dropped and re-added to the game a few times, the writing examples we initially wrote were usable as references throughout production for faction quests, for locale task cards, and other things. And now we've come back around to having a job board of sorts in the game, so we can reference these again for overall tone and writing style, which allows us to write to spec quickly. And like we said, we're 3 people on a much bigger team with work that connects intimately with the work of other departments. And none of what we've done would be possible without our tech, art, design, QA, audio, production, marketing, and operations teams. These are just a few of our coworkers. We didn't put everyone in, we didn't have space, but we love them all.
Yeah, so we're about to end the presentation, but we're going to leave you with this, which is a post from our fearless leader. When you're new to making games, it's easy to think it's about making art and making the right decisions and having the best taste, but actually making games is about dancing really good when the Old West bandit shoots bullets at your toes. And I like to think that we've gotten pretty good at dancing while he's shooting at us. He might be a little impressed.
Yeah.
But that's all, folks. Thank you so much for having us. We have like 2 minutes for Q&A. That's crazy. One question.
Any question?
Oh God, Kira.
You mentioned this idea of having a companion and helper quests early. I wanted to know the design decisions about having a
So that's actually one that I think
repeat the question.
Oh yes. So Kira is asking. Sorry, this is a friend of mine who drove up, which is why I picked them. Kira was asking about the decision to have canon versus non-canon quest completion and like the design decisions that led up to that. That's something that's a little bit more nebulous to answer because our quests are actually like genuinely just now entering production. So it's still kind of in a theoretical space at the moment. But I believe that our narrative director was inspired by the unreleased work of a colleague of theirs, that was exploring like multiplayer narrative and like how to accommodate the nebulous space of existing in different world states. And this idea of like, I want to complete this quest, but I personally haven't actually gotten to know this character yet. So like I'll complete the quest to hang out, but I do want to get to know their arc better on my own time. But that's not like the most detailed answer. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more? No?
One more?
One more.
Can I have your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have we were talking about if you're building character arcs and realizing that it wouldn't really make much sense for you to build a whole like consecutive character arcs in the character structure. When you were building out the like community narrative arcs, I know there's something else we taking next with the Western system, but like can you give some examples of how you might build out building one of those community narrative arcs?
Yeah, you want to take this?
Yeah. So the question was about how we would go about building one of the community arcs with the characters within that community storyline. So how we've been doing it is that each character page will have a sort of like a bond arc progress. So you'll see what your relationship with them is like when you're an ally with them, when you're a comrade, and when you're a confidant. And then from there, usually you will have in our outlines written for their bond arc when you unlock the possibility of beginning their quest. And for some of them, it can be when they're a comrade, and then for some of them, it can be when they're an ally, like depending on how hard they are to get to know or guarded, what sort of narrative experience you want in getting to know them. And so that gets outlined, and then we have to make sure that it can be done without in a way where you can do the other ones like in the same order. So we have to really go through, do a lot of editorial on the outlines to make sure we're not accidentally doing something like dating. And we write all of the character outlines, like their bond arcs and those quest outlines. And then once we see they can work together, they work together in any order, then we move on to the conclusion storyline, which in theory, it's taking all of those individual quests and making the kind of like wrap up moment for it.
We tend to group things by like shared cultural group, shared hobbies or interests, shared like relationship to the revolution, and like thematic ideas of like, sometimes it might be family members who are estranged from each other, or like people that all are residents of this one station that's changed over time. So we have a few different approaches for community storylines that are still purely theoretical at the moment, but we've got plans.
Yeah, like open and closed. So ones that are continuous versus ones where you have to do those quests and then you get the conclusion. Yeah.
But
Thank you
I think
for the
we're over now. But yeah, thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you guys.
Thank you.